late spring of 1995. Aurora, 26 years old, and Mark, 32 years old, chose the beautiful Corsican island for their honeymoon. Aurora and Mark got married 2 months ago, and the girl picked this place for their first vacation together. The young wife wanted to explore Corsica, its mountains, villages, and picturesque landscapes. On that day, they stopped in the cozy little town of Calvi. Here, the newlyweds had a candlelit dinner in the harbor, at a restaurant overlooking the bay. After dinner, Aurora and Mark headed towards the Notre Dame de la Serra Chapel. It is a popular spot among tourists, where lovers go to enjoy the sunset. An ideal place for a romantic end to the day. Later in the evening, around 10:30, they got into the car to return to the hotel. The young couple had to drive on a very dangerous road that sharply descended. And right at the point where the railing ended, some animal suddenly jumped onto the road in front of the car. Mark quickly turned the wheel, and the car went off the cliff. Despite the extreme situation, Aurora didn't panic. She opened the door and jumped out of the car just before it fell. Mark wasn't as fortunate. He plummeted 140 meters along with the car. Aurora was in shock, but she was alive. She made a daring decision. In the middle of the night, in pitch darkness, she descended barefoot to help her husband. Aurora found Mark in the car and pulled him out. She dragged him by the legs towards the sea and washed his face. Then, the girl climbed back up the cliff to stop a passing car and call for help. The firefighters from Calvi 1 arrived at the scene. Aurora was in hysterics, screaming and crying that her husband was down there, with a head injury and unconscious. She begged the rescuers to descend as quickly as possible and save him. The firefighters immediately headed towards the base of the cliff to find Mark, but the darkness of the night, and the uneven terrain significantly hindered their search. It took them half an hour just to locate the car. It turned out to be empty. However, they noticed a lot of blood and signs indicating that the man had a severe head injury. After several hours of relentless searching, the exhausted firefighters were ready to give up when, at 6 a.m., divers signaled that they had found something. Mark's body was floating in the water right next to the car, at a depth of 3 meters. They brought his body to the surface. Unfortunately, it was too late for the newlywed. The police compiled a report on another unfortunate incident on that stretch of road and closed the case. Mark's body was transported to his native Belgium. The young widow was utterly devastated. She couldn't cope with the grief on her own, and she was hospitalized in a specialized clinic for several days. Mark's relatives rushed to console her, but she shut herself off from the world, declaring that she didn't want to see anyone. Mark's family understood her state of mind and didn't insist. After all, at the age of 26, she had lost her husband during their honeymoon. But in the following days, her behavior intrigued Mark's family more and more. Gradually, concern gave way to suspicion. Aurora insisted on having her husband cremated, but his parents vehemently opposed the idea. On the day of the funeral, she shocked the family even further by leaving the farewell ceremony earlier than expected. Since then, the relationship between her and Mark's family became increasingly complicated. Upon returning to the family home, she changed the locks and didn't even let her mother-in-law, who had come to collect a few of her son's inexpensive but sentimental belongings, inside. In the following weeks, Aurora put the house up for sale. The sale of the house provided her with a sum equivalent to €125,000. But that wasn't all. It turned out she had received 7 insurance payouts after her husband's death. In total, Aurora received €475,000. Shocked by such behavior from their daughter-in-law, the Van Ba couple decided to take legal action and filed a complaint regarding the suspicious death, prompting the coroner to demand an investigation into the circumstances of Mark's death. To understand what actually happened that evening, investigators began by studying the lives of the couple. Approximately a year before the incident, in April 1994, 31-year-old Mark Van Ba was working at a respected financial company in Brussels. He had a wonderful job, loving parents, and friendly colleagues, and it seemed like everything in his life was going well, or almost everything. However, he had not yet met a woman with whom he wanted to spend his life. Mark was at the age when he wanted to start a family. Mark and Aurora met at a bar in Brussels. At that time, Aurora was going from door to door selling ironing boards. It was not a very profitable job. The chemistry between Mark and Aurora was instant. Mark immediately fell in love with the beautiful girl, and was crazy about her. The men's friends were envious and amazed by their vibrant relationship. Aurora was very attractive, fit, and sporty, while Mark was slightly overweight, not interested in sports, and quite shy. Yet, just a few weeks after their first meeting, Aurora moved in with Mark. The future husband's family warmly welcomed her, seeing that their son was happy with her and accepting her as their future daughter-in-law and the mother of their grandchildren. No one was surprised when the young couple decided to get married after a year. The girl set several conditions for her future husband, such as asking Mark to put half of the house in her name. This might have seemed unusual or inappropriate, but Mark, deeply in love, agreed to all of the bride's terms. On March 11, 1995, the young couple said yes to each other. The husband's entire family attended the wedding, while only the bride's twin sister was present from her side. Gradually, the husband's family began to notice that their daughter-in-law never talked about her family, evasively answering all questions about her relatives, her past, or her education. She pretended to come from a more privileged family than theirs. On September 5, 1996, more than a year after Mark's death, Aurora was invited to the police station for questioning. She confirmed the statements she had previously made. She and Mark had visited a restaurant in the port and then went to a chapel. On the way back, a wild animal suddenly jumped in front of their car. Mark turned the steering wheel, and an unfortunate accident occurred. Right before the car fell off the cliff, Aurora opened the door and jumped out. The police were unable to extract any further information from her. In an attempt to uncover the truth, Mark's body was exhumed on October 8, 1996. The forensic expert noted that some of the injuries were inflicted post-mortem. Numerous wounds were found on the body, but none were bleeding. This indicates that Mark died before the car fell off the cliff. The police wanted to question the widow again, but could not locate her anywhere. The detectives then decided to investigate the crime scene in Corsica. 2 years after the incident, Belgian police officers found themselves at the edge of the ravine where the newlyweds' car had plunged. Without the car, and armed only with photographs, the task became more challenging. Nonetheless, the expert was able to reconstruct the trajectory of the car before the fall. When something happens on the road, like an animal unexpectedly running out, a person reacts by turning the steering wheel but not by a full 90 degrees. If the car veered off the road, it should have fallen into the water, and under no circumstances could it have ended up where it was found. Additionally, the expert noticed another inconsistency with the accident theory. According to the firefighters who arrived at the scene, the bushes growing on the top of the cliff were crushed. If the car had quickly descended, the bushes would have been severed. The crushed vegetation indicated that the car had stayed on the bushes for some time before slowly rolling down. Furthermore, between the car and the water, after the incident, drops of blood were found that were unevenly distributed, suggesting that the body was carried, not dragged. Could Aurora, weighing less than 50 kilograms, have carried an 80 kilograms man? The findings of the investigation did not align with Aurora's version of events. The experts' conclusions were definitive: the car was pushed off the cliff. Now, the investigators wanted to understand what happened after the incident. Did Aurora descend to help Mark? Did she find the strength and courage to climb down the rocks barefoot? As difficult as it may be to believe, it was possible. Aurora Martin was a champion rock climber, a trained athlete, so the police couldn't easily refute the possibility that she actually descended to help her husband. It was a dead end for them. Still having no news about the young woman, the investigators decided to delve deeper into her past. Who is she really? What secrets does she hide behind her evasive answers? In reality, the girl had a very difficult childhood, where there was no place for a loving family or a proper education. When she was 12 years old, her parents divorced, and her mother moved to Germany, and the daughter rarely saw her. She lived a carefree life with her father and 2 sisters. Her father was hardly involved in her life, and when the girl turned 18, she left her childhood home with grandiose dreams. Aurora wanted to become a model and participated in beauty contests but without much success. So, she found work as a hostess in a bar, sometimes working as a model for an escort service. In February 1993, Aurora was 24 years old and lived life to the fullest, leveraging her beauty. One fine day, as usual, she went to a rock climbing club, where a fateful encounter awaited her. Peter Schuett. He was rich, young, handsome, and shared her passion for mountaineering. He was 23, and she was 24. It was love at first sight. Next to Peter, Aurora was able to turn the page on her past life. This story seemed too miraculous to be true. Indeed, while investigating Peter's past, the investigators uncovered an unusual fact for a young man of his age. Peter Schuett was a widower. His wife had died under suspicious circumstances. It happened 2 years prior when Peter turned 21 and was serving in the German army stationed in Belgium. Peter enjoyed frequenting clubs, and one evening, while hanging out with friends, he met a young student named Ursula Deschamps. Their romance was fast-paced, and within 3 months, Peter put a ring on her finger. However, Ursula quickly discovered that Peter couldn't be satisfied with just one woman. There were other surprises awaiting her. Ursula found large sums of cash and forged documents at their home. She wanted to report her findings to the police. Tensions grew in their young marriage, and they decided to get a divorce. But on the evening of August 29, 1992, Peter and Ursula got into a convertible and set off on a trip during which Peter was supposed to teach his wife how to drive. It was a strange outing for soon-to-be ex-spouses. Peter was behind the wheel and, as usual, driving very fast. He lost control, and the car plunged into a canal at high speed. Peter managed to escape in time but couldn't save his wife, who drowned along with the car. He recalled that he even touched her hand but couldn't hold on to her to pull her to the surface. Ursula's body was found several days later. The autopsy revealed nothing that would cast doubt on the fact that the girl drowned. The police reconstructed the crime scene, and Peter convincingly demonstrated how he had escaped from the car through the rear window. Ursula's family, however, never believed it was an unfortunate accident. Firstly, it was a convertible, and Peter had never lowered the top before. Secondly, Ursula was an excellent swimmer. According to an expert who later analyzed the case, Ursula had time to escape from the car as drowning doesn't occur instantly but takes around 3 minutes as the water fills the vehicle. However, the Belgian police treated it as an unfortunate accident caused by the negligence of the driver. The young widower was sentenced to 3 months in prison, and the case was closed. 2 cases, 2 crime scenes, and 2 scenarios, between which investigators couldn't help but notice coincidences. In both cases, there was a road accident, the driver lost control, and the car ended up in the water. One of the spouses managed to escape from the car in time, while the body of the other was not found in the car. Now detectives urgently needed to find Aurora and Peter, as they became the main suspects in the case of Mark Van Ber's death. Detectives also suspected Peter of Ursula's murder, but since Peter had served 3 months in connection with that case, it was possible to forget about prosecuting him again for the same crime. Meanwhile, the police learned why Ursula probably died and why Peter became so wealthy. After his wife's death, he received an insurance payout equivalent to €115,000. This allowed him to leave the army and seduce the beautiful Aurora. Their romance lasted for a year. But in early 1994, for unknown reasons, The young couple separated. It was during this time that the girl registered with a marriage agency. She described the ideal man as wealthy, with his own apartment, not overweight, and pleasant. April 1994 marked the beginning of her relationship with Mark Van Ber. 4 months after their meeting in August 1994, the girl insured Mark. Interestingly, Mark was obviously unaware of this because the documents bore not his signature, but Aurora claimed that his hand was injured, and she signed the documents for him. Soon, an unfortunate incident occurred. Aurora sold the house, received the insurance payout, and disappeared. However, she didn't stay hidden for long. 2 months after Mark's murder, investigators found her trace in Luxembourg. She opened a bank account to deposit an amount equivalent to €475,000. 2 individuals had access to the account, herself and a certain Peter Schmidt. The two reunited and moved to Miami, Florida. For almost 2 years, the lovers lived a life of luxury. Luxurious apartments, cars, and a yacht. Until a major French newspaper published an article calling them diabolical lovers and described the suspicions the police had against them. Aurora and Peter became extremely cautious. They changed their appearance and only made calls from telephone booths. They managed to hide for some time until Peter was arrested in a supermarket parking lot. He had around $50,000 with him and offered it to the police in exchange for his release, but they refused. 2 days later, the police arrested Aurora in the apartment where the lovers were hiding. Peter and Aurora did everything possible to avoid extradition. However, on December 3, 1998, they were returned to Belgium. Aurora immediately refused to give any testimony. Peter, on the other hand, spoke a lot, but little of what he said was true. Since they clearly did not want to cooperate with the investigation, the police did not have solid evidence against them. The course of the case changed due to an anonymous phone call. A woman called and revealed that she had information about Mark's murder. Later, the police identified the woman as Fabienne Lefebvre. Fabienne was Aurora's stepmother, but she had recently separated from the girl's father and decided to either seek revenge or clear her conscience. Fabienne claimed that after the tragedy in Corsica, she rushed to the hospital to comfort her stepdaughter. However, she was met by a completely different girl, not grieving at all. According to Fabienne, Aurora confessed everything to her. She stated that Peter was behind it all and that he took care of everything. When Aurora and Mark were driving on the road, Peter and 3 accomplices, his friends from Germany, stopped the car. They beat Mark with baseball bats. According to Fabienne, Mark never knew until the end who betrayed him because he begged the men to spare his wife and let her go. When the beating was over, they put Mark's body in the car and pushed it off a cliff. However, the police failed to find the accomplices or prove their existence because it didn't match Peter's character. Additionally, there were many doubts about the truthfulness of Fabienne's words. Firstly, Fabienne and Aurora had a strained relationship, and secondly, why didn't she go to the police earlier and why did she make an anonymous call? The woman claimed that she was afraid. However, the police were convinced that building a solid case based solely on Fabienne's words was not possible and sought other evidence. In Germany, the police found postcards from Corsica and photographs of the crashed car that went off the cliff in the possession of one of Peter's brothers. They were souvenir snapshots, but the intriguing part was that they were taken 6 months before Mark's murder. Was it a coincidence or careful preparation? Despite the fact that 4 years had passed since the murder, the details of the crime remained a mystery. On June 16, 1999, the police decided to reconstruct the crime scene at the airport. The driver was driving the car at a speed not exceeding 35 km/h. Aurora was supposed to open the car door wide, as if trying to jump out. She failed to do so, even when the car significantly reduced its speed. She became angry, cried, and had hysterical outbursts, trying to find an explanation for her failure. Peter intervened, attempting to defend Aurora. It is unclear why he was participating in the reconstruction at all, since theoretically, he was not present during the crime in Corsica. After this experiment, the investigators were convinced that Mark Van Ba did not die as a result of an accident but was murdered. The trial began. The defendant's lawyers proposed a new version of events. Allegedly, Mark suffered a heart attack just before falling from a height. In other words, he died a few seconds before the accident, and therefore all the injuries he sustained afterwards became post-mortem. This was a hypothesis that could undermine the entire theory of prosecution. Even the forensic expert considered it a clever move, but such a version did not correspond to the autopsy results. Furthermore, during the trial, the forensic expert revealed another extremely important detail: Mark hadn't eaten anything for several hours before the crime. He was hungry. The fact that Aurora even lied about the romantic dinner with her husband that evening was the final straw for the jurors. They found both of them guilty. Aurora was sentenced to 15 years, and Peter to 20 years. It is unlikely that they served even half of their sentences. They were released long ago. Despite Peter being deported to Germany, and Aurora being prohibited from leaving the country, as of 2021, they were still together. Peter found work as a carpenter, and thanks to her fluency in several languages, Aurora works. The most remarkable thing about this case is that Aurora and Peter committed two almost perfect murders. And the second crime would undoubtedly have gone unnoticed if Aurora had been a little more patient and hadn't slammed the door in front of her husband's family. If she had remained the same pleasant girl they knew, she would have calmly left after a few months, and the Van Ba family would never have suspected her of anything.
Cape May, New Jersey is the oldest seaside resort in America. It is known for its Victorian-style homes, pristine beaches, and safe spots for pleasant sea excursions. The best fishing spots are another advantage of Cape May. On October 8, 2003, a couple was enjoying a day of fishing on a boat when they spotted something in the water that they initially thought was trash floating on the surface. However, as they got closer, they realized it was a human body. The Coast Guard responded to the report of the grim discovery. They carefully retrieved the body from the water. Decomposition had already set in, but it was immediately clear that the body belonged to a woman. It didn't take a genius to understand that the woman had been murdered. Her legs were bound with heavy chains, and tape was wrapped around her wrists and ankles. A stone crab, which lives and feeds on the ocean floor, was clinging to her hip. This detail was important, as it indicated that the body had at some point sunk to the bottom of the ocean. In other words, someone had tried to dispose of the body but didn't account for the fact that, without additional weight, gases would eventually cause it to resurface, and fairly quickly. That's exactly what happened in this case. The victim had been in the water for just over a week. The woman was clothed but had no identification on her, so the New Jersey police who arrived at the scene couldn't immediately determine her identity. Another simple and obvious way to identify the victim is by checking fingerprints against national databases. Of course, after spending an extended period in cool water, the skin on her fingers had wrinkled. However, by injecting a saline solution under the skin, the forensic expert was able to restore the fingerprints to a usable state. The victim was identified as 16-year-old Kimberly Holton, a runaway from a foster family in Dover, Delaware. Now, the task was to figure out what happened between her disappearance in Delaware and how she ended up off the coast of Cape May. Kimberly, known to her friends and family as Kim or Kimmy, was born on November 4, 1986 in Delaware. At the time of her birth, her mother was struggling with substance abuse and her father was in prison. Kimberly never stayed long in one home, constantly being passed from one family member to another. Despite this instability, her character remained unaffected. The 16-year-old Kimberly was a sweet, kind, and caring young girl, always friendly and compassionate. She would occasionally share stories of her early childhood with her best friend Destiny, but her cheerful nature helped her to not dwell on the past, serving as her way to shield herself from those memories. Kimberly had a deep love for animals and always tried to help them, as no one had been there to help her when she needed it most. If given the opportunity, Kimberly likely would have become a veterinarian. Her teachers saw her as a wonderfully talented child who deserved a better start in life than the hardships she had endured. Her mother had failed to provide even the basics, like food, let alone toys. Kimberly's first foster mother adored her. They lived together for 3 years and were planning to move to Tennessee together. Their bags were already packed when, out of nowhere, Kimberly's grandfather and his wife showed up at the foster mother's house. They announced that the state had transferred custody to them, and Kimberly would now be living with them. However, her grandfather was unable to provide a stable home either, and Kimberly was returned to the foster care system. This time, she was placed with Lorraine and Rudy Machette, who were already raising another teenage girl, Heather. Kimberly was living with them when, on September 30th, 2003, 8 days before her body was found in New Jersey, she missed school. Kimberly was not one to skip classes, and when she didn't get on the school bus that day, Destiny knew something was wrong. That same evening, her foster mother, Lorraine, reported the teenager missing. Now, the police faced the difficult task of informing Lorraine that her foster daughter, Kimberly, was dead, murdered. Lorraine was genuinely upset by the news, but she admitted that she hadn't searched more actively for Kimberly because the girl had disappeared before. Kimberly had run away from home for several days at a time, but had always returned. This admission hinted to the investigators that there had been underlying problems in the household even before Kimberly went missing in late September. As a result, they took Lorraine to the station for a more detailed interrogation. The detectives wanted to understand what had been happening at home and what might have driven Kimberly to run away, not just this last time, but on previous occasions as well. Lorraine stated that her husband, Rudy, whom she was now planning to divorce, had made inappropriate advances toward their foster daughter. Just 2 weeks earlier, Kimberly had gone to the police, reporting that Rudy had gotten into bed with her and did things he shouldn't have done. The court hearing for that case was scheduled to take place in just a few days. As soon as Lorraine said this, the police saw the motive for murder they had been missing. They were convinced that Rudy was behind Kimberly's death. Lorraine's opinion was shared by Kimberly's best friend, Destiny. Destiny told the detectives that some time ago, Rudy had followed them in his car while they were just walking down the street, terrifying them. It got to the point where Destiny told her parents, and they reported it to the police. Naturally, Rudy was brought in for questioning. The detectives fully expected to get a confession from the suspect. However, Rudy seemed genuinely shocked by the girl's death. Of course, he could have been a very good actor, but at the time of Kimberly's murder, he had an alibi. During the days when Kimberly went missing, he had been staying with his adult biological daughter. His alibi checked out, and the police had no choice but to release him. The investigators hoped that the autopsy might shed light on how the girl was killed, which could help them find the murderer. After all, there were hardly any injuries on her body, aside from those caused by prolonged exposure to the water. They didn't even know whether she was alive when she was thrown into the water or already dead. But what they found only deepened the mystery. The pathologist found no DNA, gunshot wounds, stab marks, or any other clues that would point to the killer or the method of murder. The only significant finding was a severe fracture at the base of her skull. However, it wasn't caused by a blow with an object, but rather from a fall from a great height, like falling from a 5-story building. The medical examiner and the investigators were baffled. If she had been thrown into the water from a boat, she would have fallen from a height of no more than 3 meters. They couldn't understand who would kill a teenage girl by pushing her out of a window from an apartment or hotel room, only to then run down, pick up the body, put it in a car, drive to a dock, and finally dump her in the ocean after wrapping her in tape and chains. It made no sense at all. The investigators were left with only one piece of evidence to work with: the chains wrapped around Kimberly's legs. They had started to rust. However, upon examining them, the forensic experts noticed that each link of the chain had a stamp. This meant the chains could potentially be traced back to a specific store, or at least a chain of stores. They were right. These particular chains were sold at Lowe's, a home improvement retail chain. Conveniently, a Lowe's store was located near the trailer park where Kimberly had lived with her foster family. Luckily, the store manager was able to pinpoint exactly when the chains were sold. They had been purchased on September 30th, 2003, the day after Kimberly disappeared. Along with the chains, the buyers had also purchased 2 cinder blocks and locks. Investigators requested the surveillance footage. and they saw two young men at the checkout paying for the chains and cinder blocks before leaving. Unfortunately, tracking them down wouldn't be easy. The men had paid in cash. The video footage was also somewhat blurry, with the camera positioned high up near the ceiling. However, the men weren't hiding their behavior. They were chatting casually, walking back and forth through the store, and their gestures and mannerisms were distinct enough to identify them later. So the detectives shared the video with the press. This proved to be a major breakthrough in the case, as the police station was flooded with calls. The callers mentioned various names, but one came up more often than others: Robert Brothers. More importantly, Robert himself called the police to confirm that he was one of the men in the video. They asked him to come down to the station, where the young man appeared visibly nervous and eager to explain that he had nothing to do with the crime. Robert told the detectives that he had been at the store with his friend, Jacob Jones, who had recently decided to get into fitness and planned to use the chains and cinder blocks as workout equipment. The detectives, however, still found this explanation to be too much of a coincidence. So they asked Robert if there was any connection between Jacob and Kimberly. Robert then mentioned just one name: Heather. Robert didn't personally know either of the girls, but he knew that Heather was Lorraine's daughter, meaning she was Kimberly's foster sister. Heather and Jacob had been dating since high school. The detectives let Robert go, convinced that he was telling the truth and had no further information. However, their attention quickly shifted to what Heather might have to say about all this. Heather openly admitted that, as teenage girls living together in a trailer, she and Kimberly often fought over small things, like borrowing clothes without asking and other typical sibling squabbles. Kimberly and Jacob didn't get along either, as Kimberly liked to tease him. But when Kimberly disappeared and hadn't returned for a couple of days, Heather started to genuinely worry about her sister. She wanted to talk about her concerns with Jacob, but he simply refused to discuss the matter. Heather also recognized her boyfriend in the store video and texted him asking, "You didn't do this, did you?" He never replied. However, Heather was confident that Jacob wasn't capable of murder. He wasn't that kind of person. And indeed, Jacob Jones didn't fit the profile of a typical suspect. The 20-year-old had never been in trouble with the law. In fact, he was a university student and one of the top students in his class. Additionally, he was a member of the university's Aero Club and was an experienced pilot and instructor. He was held in such high regard by the club that he had the privilege to borrow a plane at any time. During Jacob's interrogation, it was evident that the young man was frightened. He insisted that he had bought the chains and cinder blocks for workout purposes. However, he was unable to explain where the cinder blocks were currently located. When he realized he couldn't answer several questions, he requested the presence of a lawyer. The detectives were concerned that Jacob might destroy any remaining evidence if there was any, but they had no choice but to release him. Meanwhile, they continued to gather evidence against him and discovered that the last time Jacob had flown the plane was on September 30th at approximately 11:45 p.m. He returned just 2 hours later. This couldn't be a coincidence. The detectives were now convinced that Jacob had loaded the body into the plane and dropped it over the ocean. This explained the post-mortem head injury Kimberly had sustained. However, Jacob was not a very large person. He wouldn't have been able to load the heavy cinder blocks, chains, and the dead body into the plane on his own. Jacob must have had an accomplice. The evidence against Jacob was sufficient for his arrest. On October 23rd, detectives were preparing to go to his home to arrest him and bring him in. However, they received a call from Jacob's father, who reported that his son had passed away. It seemed that after the interrogation, Jacob realized that the police were closing in on the truth and that he would be arrested. Unable to bear the thought of spending the rest of his life in prison or facing execution, he had taken a weapon, gone to his room, and pulled the trigger. Before doing so, he confessed to his parents that he had murdered Kimberly Holton. When the detectives arrived, the scene at the family home was surreal. Jacob's parents could not believe that their son, who had confessed to killing the girl, was now dead himself. Jacob had given his father a very vague explanation for why he had killed Kimberly. He simply said that she had caused problems in the family and conflicts with Heather. Therefore, he decided to take matters into his own hands and fix the situation. He went to the store, bought the chains and cinder blocks with the intention of killing Kimberly. Finally, Jacob confessed to his parents, who had been with him that night. And no, it wasn't Robert Brothers who had bought the chains with Jacob. His accomplice was named Michael Kaiser. Investigators had never heard of him before. Michael was 23 years old and worked as a security guard at a local racetrack. Michael and Jacob worked for the same security company and were more like colleagues and acquaintances than close friends. The detectives wanted to speak with Michael, but were sure he would immediately start denying everything. So they devised a plan to make Michael nervous. At their request, Jacob's father called Michael on his cell phone while he was on his way to work. He told Michael that Jacob had left a note confessing to the murder and naming his accomplice, Michael. The man added that he was heading to the police station to speak with the authorities. Meanwhile, the detectives followed Michael in their car, expecting anything, that he might do something foolish or attempt to flee. But suddenly he drove straight to the police station. The young man was in a highly emotional state, but confidently stated that he wanted to speak with the detectives investigating Kimberly Holton's case. Initially, during the interrogation, he tried to insist that he knew nothing about the crime, but eventually confessed to everything. Michael explained that, at Jacob's request, on September 29th, he had picked up Kimberly. They bought drinks from a store together and then went to a motel under the pretense of discussing conflicts between Heather and Kimberly. According to Michael, while they were driving, Kimberly revealed that she and Jacob were actually in a relationship, loved each other, and Jacob had promised to help her find a new place to live. At the motel, Jacob joined them. Again, according to Michael, they talked, joked, and everything seemed fine. Kimberly had intimate relations with Jacob and then with Michael while Jacob watched. Afterward, Kimberly went to the bathroom. Michael thought the evening was going well until Jacob suddenly declared he wanted to kill Kimberly, and Michael would help him do it and dispose of the body. Michael did not want to participate but yielded because Jacob threatened to kill him too. When Kimberly came out of the bathroom, Jacob grabbed her, ordered Michael to hold her legs, and wrapped a phone cord around her neck while placing a pillow on her head and strangled her. Kimberly desperately fought back but soon went silent and stopped moving. Jacob checked her pulse. She was dead. It was just after 2 in the morning when the killers moved the body to the trunk. Kimberly spent almost the entire day in the trunk of the car. The next night, the men drove to the airport where they transferred the girl to the plane along with the chains and cinder blocks. Jacob flew alone, soared over the Atlantic Ocean, passed Cape May, and dropped the body. 2 days after his confession, Michael attempted to follow Jacob by hanging himself in his cell. But the guards arrived in time and saved him, barely pulling him back from the brink. If they had been a minute later, he would have been beyond help. Michael was offered a plea deal for second-degree murder and an 18-year sentence, but he chose to go to trial, believing he would be acquitted. He was wrong. On January 6, 2004, Michael was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy. The death penalty had not been abolished in Delaware, but the judge leaned towards a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The judge told Michael that Kimberly's relationship with her foster family was none of his concern. Instead of stopping Jacob, he had helped kill a 16-year-old girl who had done nothing to him. The motive for the crime remained unclear. Whether Jacob loved Kimberly and was dating her behind his girlfriend's back, as Michael claimed, or wanted to please Heather, who blamed Kimberly for the breakup of her family, as investigators suggested, or whether he genuinely hated the girl and wanted to eliminate her to end the problems she caused, as he told his father, was uncertain. Investigators wanted to get to the bottom of it and spoke with Heather one last time. Heather insisted she did not believe Jacob and Kimberly were seeing each other behind her back. According to Heather and other mutual acquaintances, Jacob hated Kimberly because she mocked him in front of Heather. So much so that he stopped visiting his girlfriend's home when Kimberly was there. Detectives found no evidence that Heather was involved in the sinister murder plot. The girl moved to Colorado, attended a community college, and continued to see a therapist for several years to cope with the trauma. Today, Kimberly Holton would be 37 years old. She has been gone longer than she lived on this earth. Had Kimberly been given a better start in life, everything might have turned out very differently. She might have become a veterinarian, as she had always dreamed. And her children might have played with the babies of her best friend, Destiny. But just when it seemed she was finding happiness in her foster family, it was ripped away from her, and the nightmares began anew. From childhood, she never knew whom to trust and believed these men. And when Kimberly went missing, everyone assumed it was just another runaway, and no one searched for her. There were no tearful appeals from parents on television, no flyers, no large-scale searches with tracking dogs and helicopters. Kimberly's case could have remained unsolved, and everyone might have thought she decided not to come back this time. But Jacob did not account for one crucial element of his plan: the ocean. The plane flew at such a high altitude that when Kimberly's body hit the water, it was akin to a concrete impact at 210 kilometers per hour. The cinder blocks shattered upon impact. This gap in Jacob's knowledge allowed the truth to surface along with Kimberly's body. The young wife and mother were brutally murdered. The police embark on a chase after the elusive killer, following a tangled trail of clues. They will have only one chance, a desperate move, to unravel this case and uncover a secret that shocked everyone. At 10:27 p.m. on a cold January Tuesday in 2003, the Ramapo emergency dispatcher received a call. The female caller reported that her neighbor had just run to her, stating that his wife was lying on the floor covered in blood. The man was in a state of shock, but managed to explain to the dispatcher that his wife was not breathing and not responding to his calls. Rescue service personnel rushed to the house, located in the quiet residential area of Chestnut Ridge. They found a man with a small child sitting on the steps in front of the house. Next to him was a bag from the store with a large package of milk. Upon entering the bedroom on the second floor, the police discovered the woman. It was abundantly clear that there was no way to help the homeowner. She had very deep wounds on her neck. The handle of a knife protruded from her chest, and blood was pooling around her body. Recognizing it as a crime scene, the officers cordoned it off and summoned detectives. The detectives who arrived at the crime scene began inspecting the bedroom. They found it odd that the lights were not on, but the ceiling fan was running. 3 light bulbs were found scattered in the trash can, with one lying nearby. Someone had also tampered with the bulb in the wall sconce to ensure it didn't work. This suggested that someone attempted to conceal their presence and prevent the victim from seeing them. She indeed had no chance to fight for her life. Multiple deep and forceful stabs from the knife pierced through her chest and lodged into the floorboards. One of the strikes landed on Evelyn's back. This meant that there was no light in the room, and she stood with her back to the assailant. Consequently, she couldn't see them at all. Typically, a robber would aim to leave swiftly, but in this case, the killer viciously attacked, repeatedly stabbing her. It seemed more like a crime of passion, as if the murder was something personal, and the perpetrator aimed to vent their rage on the victim. Moreover, expensive tools were left in the garage, and there was silver in the house. A thief wouldn't leave without taking valuables. Perhaps the woman startled the intruder. Another question arose: how did they get inside? The windows were intact, and everything seemed securely locked. However, there were traces in the snow leading to the back door of the house. Investigators spoke to the man who called the police. Peter Visick stated that the victim was his wife, 36-year-old Evelyn Visick. They lived in the house with their 2-year-old son, Ryan. Peter explained that he and his son returned home from the store to find Evelyn in that state. When a wife is killed, suspicion primarily falls on the husband. The man mentioned that the last time he saw Evelyn alive was in the morning. She left for work, and he spent the entire day with his son. At 8:30, they went to Peter's parents to assist with something. Peter didn't have a steady job, and his parents supported him by giving him odd jobs. They stayed at his parents' home with Ryan until evening. Around 9 p.m., he called his wife on her mobile. She said she would be home in about 20 minutes. At around 10 p.m., Evelyn called asking where they were. Peter replied that he was buying milk and would be home soon. Upon arriving home, he wanted to put Ryan to bed immediately, but he was puzzled by the lack of light in the hallway. He peeked into the bedroom and saw Evelyn lying on the floor. He then rushed to the neighbors. The rest was already known to the police. In total, Peter was interrogated for over 16 hours, yet he never once mentioned wanting to leave, asked for a lawyer, or demanded to be left alone. Nothing of the sort. He willingly provided fingerprints, hair, nail samples, DNA, and more. Furthermore, he had never had any legal issues. On the contrary, he was the kind of person who, when not at home, would be at his parents' place. His mother confirmed they spent the entire day there with Ryan. Security cameras and a receipt for purchasing milk issued at 10:15 p.m. showed that he indeed made purchases at the supermarket. He couldn't have possibly returned home, committed the crime, changed clothes, and called the police from the neighbor's house. It became clear that the man had no connection to his wife's murder. However, investigators inquired if he was worried about his own life. Perhaps the killer was coming after him. Maybe he owed someone money or was involved in illicit substances, gambling. To all these questions, he replied no. The final question, did he know anyone capable of such an act? "You should talk to Evelyn's boyfriend calmly," said Peter. Investigators didn't expect this turn. A few years ago, Evelyn met Peter when he and his father were shopping at the hypermarket where she worked. He was very quiet, polite, a wonderful guy. Evelyn understood that this was the person she wanted to build her future with. They got married, and soon they had a child. But gradually, after 4 years, the couple's relationship hit a dead end. Peter explained that their views on family life differed. He wanted his wife to stay home while she wanted to work, causing cracks in their marriage. Evelyn filed for divorce, but they continued to live in the same house. Since Peter was a wonderful father, Evelyn wanted him to be involved in their son's life. At the same time, she was seeing another store employee named Mike Grande. So the police dealt with a couple who planned to divorce, but continued to live together. As if this wasn't enough, they added a lover to the mix, and it was unknown how he felt about all this. If Evelyn's boyfriend was jealous, his passionate nature perfectly fit the crime scene, indicating that it was a crime of passion. At 8 a.m., the police headed to Evelyn's workplace to speak with Mike. Her colleagues were already suspicious because she never missed a day at work. They weren't just friends, but a family. Evelyn came to the USA from Puerto Rico at the age of 19 and started working at a hypermarket in New Jersey. Having almost no relatives in the States, she formed very close relationships with other co-workers. Evelyn was an excellent worker, positive, lively, and kind-hearted. Therefore, all her colleagues adored her and couldn't believe she had been killed. When her boyfriend Mike arrived for his shift and was informed of the news, he was visibly upset too. However, when asked about his whereabouts the previous evening, the man's answer astonished the detectives. On the evening of the murder, he was with Evelyn. Detectives immediately envisioned a scenario of a jealous lover killing his victim in a fit of rage. Mike promptly became the prime suspect in the case. At the station, the 28-year-old man said that initially he and Evelyn were just friends, but then a spark ignited between them and they started dating. On the day before, they left work at 3 p.m. In the evening, she planned to cook dinner and eat with her son, but Peter called and warned her that he would be taking Ryan to his mother's. Then she called Mike and told him she was free. They had dinner at Mike's house, after which the woman prepared to head home. Her house was a 40-minute drive from his place, and Mike called her when she was roughly halfway there. Only 40 minutes after that call, Evelyn was killed. According to Mike, he spent the rest of the evening at home, watched TV, and went to bed. Detectives checked his phone records. His phone remained at home all evening. If he had gone to Evelyn, he would have passed at least one cell tower. Also, no surveillance cameras along the route recorded his car. This led the detectives to believe that he was at home during Evelyn's murder. Colleagues also never thought Mike capable of such an act. He treated Evelyn well, provided her with the support she needed, and placed her on a pedestal. Like the victim's husband, Mike was willing to cooperate in every way. He provided DNA samples, fingerprints, his phone, laptop, and even offered to search his home and car if necessary. He was swiftly removed from the list of suspects. So, the husband was not involved. The boyfriend was not involved. The search for suspects continued. The murderer could have been anyone. But it's important to understand that this is a tiny town where murders are extremely rare. However, precisely during that time, a gang of robbers operated in the vicinity. Among them was a certain Terrence Monk. Monk could be ruthless and furious with those who refused to cooperate. He was involved in a robbery 1.5 miles from the Visage house. He fit well as a suspect, but since the police had been dealing with him for several years and quite diligently, there were no chances of cooperation from his side. So, to obtain the necessary information, investigators resorted to another approach. They turned to an informant to find out where Terrence was on the day of the murder and whether he was connected to it. It turned out he was in Buffalo, New York. As confirmed by witnesses and phone company records, another dead end for the detectives. As the police informant was deeply entrenched in the city's criminal environment, investigators asked what was being said on the streets about the case. If a local had attacked Evelyn, someone would have known something. But the informant assured them that he absolutely knew nothing. The police returned to the very beginning. They again interviewed friends and colleagues of the woman, trying to determine if she had enemies or led a secret lifestyle. But her friends genuinely loved her, and no one could imagine anyone capable of harming her. Evelyn, in turn, devoted herself entirely to her son and took care of him. In the area where Evelyn and Peter's house was located, it was forbidden to park on the street at night. Perhaps parking permits were issued to some. That was also not the case. Investigators had to admit, at least to themselves, that the case probably would never be solved. Finally, 3 days after the murder, the police received information that turned the investigation upside down and sent them on a fresh trail. Mike Grandy came to the precinct. He brought some of Evelyn's belongings. Among these items were an audio recording and the woman's diary. Detectives immediately recognized the voices on the recordings. It was Evelyn and Peter. Evelyn secretly recorded some arguments and disputes with her husband. They argued about money she spent. He wanted to take her car away and stop paying for her phone. In other words, he sought complete control over his wife. This contradicted what Visich had said. But that was not all. They were getting divorced but lived under one roof because neither of the spouses wanted to be the one who left the home, the family, and the child, because the opposing party could portray it in a negative light. Especially since Peter wanted full custody of their son and to sell the house. Of course, the court wouldn't allow him to take the child and throw his ex-wife out onto the street. But without Evelyn, nothing would stop him from achieving what he intended. When detectives attempted to discuss this with Peter, they encountered a wall of silence because he had already hired a lawyer and didn't want to communicate with the police. Given that Peter had an alibi, investigators had to consider different scenarios. Perhaps he didn't commit the murder, but he must have been involved considering how much he gained from it. Fortunately for the police, suspicions were enough to obtain a search warrant for the car. Desperately trying to find any lead, they made a surprising discovery. In the car, there was an envelope containing $3,700 in cash and a phone card. Both were peculiar. Firstly, the man wasn't employed. He didn't withdraw such sums from his accounts. Where did he get this amount and why? Secondly, he had both a mobile and a landline phone. Why did he need a phone card? Of course, the police checked whom Peter called. He dialed a certain Frank son 44 times, starting from November 2002 exactly until the day of the murder in January 2003. The police didn't recognize the name, but after running his name through the database, they found that he had been arrested multiple times for assaults. The last time he was detained was in New Jersey when an officer found an intoxicated Frank with a loaded pistol in his car, and this happened shortly after Evelyn's murder. Could there be an innocent explanation for why Peter called a repeat offender in the months leading up to his wife's murder, then abruptly stopped the day after her death? Examining Frank's phone data, the police determined that his phone was near the Visich house on January 6th and 7th, which is before and on the day of the murder. However, just because it was Frank's phone didn't mean he was present that day. Therefore, knowing that the man enjoyed drinking, the officers checked all cafes, bars, and restaurants near the victim's home. Everywhere, they showed Frank's photo and asked if anyone had seen him. They got lucky. It turned out the man indeed visited the popular local bar, Silo. The female bartender remembered him because she called him Frank, and they exchanged a couple of words about how similar their names sounded. So the witness's testimony confirmed that on the day of the murder, Frank was a mile away from the victim's home. It was evident that he was somehow involved in the crime. During the search of his apartment, the police confiscated his computer. Frank believed he had cleared it, but the police found that Frank had searched for directions from his apartment to the Visich family home online. The evidence was piling up, but from a legal standpoint, all the detectives could prove was that Frank frequently communicated with Peter by phone. The investigators had no choice but to pressure Frank and attempt to obtain a confession. Doing so would be challenging. If he asked for a lawyer, the interrogation would have to stop. He would deny everything, and the police wouldn't be able to disprove his words. Now, everything depended on the interrogation and the skill of the detectives conducting it. The detectives requested the suspect to be isolated before their arrival and allocated the smallest room for conversation. They brought along numerous photos of Evelyn, boxes of documents bearing her name, maps, and various other items. This created an impression that the small room was entirely filled with evidence pertaining to the case. Setting the scene, officers introduced 41-year-old Frank into the room. While they removed the handcuffs from him, the detectives didn't rush into conversation. They positioned him with his back against the wall, making it seem like there was nowhere for him to escape. Furthermore, one detective sat extremely close to him, as people find it hard to lie when someone is practically in their personal space. The police watched the suspect in oppressive silence for 2 minutes to elevate the tension further, and it worked. Frank was visibly unsettled. Then the detective declared that they were uninterested in whatever he might say. The police knew everything. For the contracted murder in New York, you could face the death penalty. We have all the evidence to prove it. The detective pressed. Frank was clearly nervous, sweating, and the vein in his neck was pulsating madly. But the investigator persisted. If you confess, we'll try to help you get the best deal. He reminded Frank in detail about his visit to a bar near the victim's home. This final detail convinced the man that the police knew it all. After a long, excruciating pause, he took a deep breath and confessed that he was hired to kill Evelyn Visich. About 3 months ago, Peter Visich asked his acquaintance if he knew someone who could deal with his wife. That person introduced Peter to Frank. For the job, Frank requested $10,000, half in advance. Peter borrowed the money from a friend and demanded the job be done as quickly as possible. On January 7th, the fateful day arrived. When Evelyn was at work, Peter unlocked the back door of the house, which is how the killer gained entry. The footprints in the snow confirmed this. As Frank waited for the victim, he unscrewed the light bulbs. Suddenly, Peter's van arrived at the house. He was with his son. Frank spotted the son through the window, warned Peter, and gestured to leave. Peter replied that he had been talking to his wife on the phone and she would be home in 20 minutes, then drove away. Soon enough, Evelyn arrived. As she ascended to the bedroom, Frank tried to sneak up from behind, but she heard his last step and turned around. Evelyn didn't scream. Frank ordered her to lie face down on the bed, promising only to rob her. Before stabbing her, he told the poor woman that he would save her from her miserable life and confessed that her husband had hired him. Then he stabbed her repeatedly because Peter's instructions were clear in his mind to execute the job splendidly. Frank admitted guilt for first-degree murder. However, in exchange for his truthful and detailed testimony in court, they promised him a punishment ranging from 20 years of imprisonment to life. In November 2003, the trial against Peter began. The courtroom was filled with Evelyn's friends, and it was a difficult time for them, especially when Frank testified. It was a betrayal, both literally and figuratively, planned by Evelyn's husband. Frank's son became the actual instrument of the murder, but it was Peter Visich who brought that instrument into his own home. Frank detailed his acquaintance with Peter, how he hurried to have his wife killed, and finally, about Evelyn's murder. The trial lasted for 8 days. The defendant did not take the witness stand and displayed no emotions. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury members found Peter guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A tangled love story unfolds like a dark detective tale, a crime film, a film noir, with a timeless plot where lust and obsession lead to murder and classic betrayal. This was Jaime's favorite genre, and he played the lead villain. Patricia helped dress him in the costume of a deranged, jealous man, work overalls, gloves, and a stocking mask. Then she, the true star of this film, brilliantly played the victim. Thirsting for authenticity, she cut her own hand and barricaded herself in the bathroom, clutching a real revolver in her bleeding hand to complete the authenticity of her fabricated image. All that was missing was a camera to focus on her wild eyes and feigned horror as she aimed the revolver and fired. On June 25, 2008, at 1:15 a.m., while the residents of Garden Valley, California were peacefully sleeping in their beds, the fire station received a report of a fire blazing along a winding road above a deep gorge. This is a challenging area with many sharp turns, hills, and ravines. Only upon getting closer did the firefighters notice that a burning SUV was at the center of the fire. Their experience told them that the body of the driver might be inside. Unfortunately, they were right. The body, like the entire vehicle, was completely engulfed in flames. Earlier that evening, a report had been made to the emergency services about a missing resident who had gone to buy propane in his Chevrolet Suburban and had not returned. The firefighters could see that the vehicle burning before them was indeed a Suburban. The missing man was 54-year-old Ron Presba. Around 9 p.m., he had left to buy propane for a barbecue and never returned. The remains found at the scene were sent for an autopsy, but officers were able to identify the burned vehicle, and it was indeed Ron's SUV. The news quickly spread throughout Garden Valley. Many people knew Ron personally and were saddened by the news. Initially, everything pointed to the man being the victim of a road accident. On such a rough road, there were many opportunities for a vehicle to go off into the ravine and catch fire. The propane Ron was carrying only added fuel to the blaze. Firefighters found 2 large pools of blood, each more than a meter in diameter, on the road. They speculated that the man had hit a deer, a large animal that could cause such a significant amount of blood. It was hard to imagine a worse place to encounter an animal, a dark, winding road above a deep ravine without any guardrails or barriers. Many people in such situations react by sharply turning the wheel. However, the firefighters could not find the body of the struck animal near the collision site. Moreover, upon closer inspection, the bloodstains looked strange. Between the larger pools of blood were smaller bloodstains, as if something was bleeding, then stopped, then started bleeding again. Nearby, there was a partial footprint and some sort of stain, as if a package or something similar had been lying there. Additionally, there were acceleration marks near the scene, indicating that someone had left the scene in a vehicle, and quickly. Considering these strange findings on the road, the fire investigator suspected that this was not an accident. The suspicions of the fire investigator were confirmed when he found a bag with a reddish liquid near the burned-out vehicle. At first, he mistook it for transmission fluid, but it was strangely covered in flies. Upon closer examination, to his horror, he realized that the bag contained hair, skull fragments, and brain matter. The bag had traces of fire, although the flames hadn't yet reached it. This meant that Ron's vehicle had been set on fire before it went off the ravine. It was likely stopped, set ablaze, and then pushed down the slope. The bag was thrown afterward. This was clearly done intentionally. At the coroner's office, it was confirmed that the victim was Ron Presba. The blood on the road and in the bag also belonged to him. Ron had been murdered, and the fire was used to cover up the crime. Police investigators began their work, and the morning after the body was discovered, they spoke with the victim's wife, Patricia, or Patty. Patty seemed overwhelmed with grief, but was eager to help the police. She said that Ron had no enemies. In fact, someone like him couldn't have had enemies. He was one of the pillars of the Garden Valley community. Everyone saw him as a loving father, devoted husband, very honest, hardworking, reliable, and an all-around wonderful person. Ron would give you the shirt off his back to help someone. He had spent many years building his trucking company before he met Patty. Patty worked for the California Conservation Corps and was part of a program that taught young people who would otherwise get into trouble with the law useful labor skills in firefighting, forest protection, and conservation. It was essentially a work camp for troubled youth. Both Patty and Ron had adult children from previous relationships. The day before, at 4:30 p.m., Patty had gone to visit her daughter and grandchildren who lived an hour away. She called her husband around 9 p.m., and he mentioned that he was going to get propane for the barbecue. However, when she returned at midnight, the house was empty. Ron's daughters told the police that a guest had been staying with the family in recent weeks. This guest was 21-year-old Jaime Ramos. Detectives returned to the family home to speak with Patty again. She confirmed that Jaime Ramos had been living with the family for 3 weeks. He was one of the troubled young people assisted by the California Conservation Corps, and Patty had been his mentor. Jaime Ramos had joined the program a year ago after being charged with assault. Patty and Ron decided to help the young man save money so he could visit his relatives in Texas. Patty described Jaime as a nice guy who had faced many challenges since childhood. His mother had taken her own life when he was just 2 years old. His father was in and out of his life, and after being passed around by various relatives, he eventually went to live with his grandmother, who became like a mother to him. Now Patty had taken on the role of his mentor and friend, and Jaime often sought her advice. She explained that Jaime was finishing his training program at the center, but needed a place to stay for the remaining month. Patty had asked Ron if Jaime could stay in their spare bedroom, and Ron, being a kind-hearted person, agreed. Ron welcomed Jaime into their home, and they developed a strong bond, with Ron becoming like a father figure to Jaime. However, just the day before, Jaime had left. They had lent him some money so he could travel to his relatives in Texas. Jaime's sudden departure seemed suspicious. especially since Patty claimed she didn't know how to contact him. In other words, they had lent the young man money, but she had no way to reach him. Before the detectives could ask Patty further questions, something caught their eye. A few drops of blood by the fireplace caught the detectives' attention. Although there weren't many, they deemed it important and called in the forensic team. Upon their arrival, they processed the room with luminol, causing it to light up with traces of blood that someone had attempted to clean. The detectives realized they had stumbled upon the murder scene. Since Patty had an alibi, Jaime seemed the most likely suspect. However, according to Patty, she and Ron had a good relationship with Jaime. Nevertheless, the detectives reached out to Jaime's family in Texas, who said he was still en route but provided his phone number. Over the phone, Jaime confirmed that Ron had become a true friend and mentor to him in a short period. He expressed his desire to help the police uncover the truth about Ron's death. Strangely, though, he refused to disclose his whereabouts. Since Jaime was using a prepaid phone, the police couldn't trace his location. Instead, they tried to gain his trust, encouraging Jaime to keep calling them and persuade him to reveal what he knew about Ron's death. Meanwhile, Curtis Edwards reached out to them. Curtis was also a member of the program helping young people, just like Jaime. Moreover, Jaime was his roommate. Therefore, he knew something that, in his opinion, no one else suspected. Jaime and Patty were having a romance. Curtis was shocked. All the young people in the organization loved Patty, calling her Mom, but Jaime clearly had feelings for her of a different nature. Despite being 21 years old while she was 47, he was younger than her children. Nonetheless, Jaime asked Curtis not to tell anyone about it. As his friend, Curtis agreed, but now he felt obligated to inform the police. The meeting with the detectives was brief, but its importance for the investigation couldn't be underestimated. Because now the investigators knew that Jaime could have a motive for Ron's murder. It was worth talking to Patty again, because it became clear that she knew more than she was saying. Patty reluctantly admitted that she had been involved with Jaime, but a couple of days before Ron's murder, she ended things with her lover because his behavior was increasingly alarming her. When she brought up the breakup, they were in the car, and Jaime swerved the car as if he wanted to crash into an oncoming vehicle. Fortunately, they avoided the accident, but Patty realized he was willing to do anything just to be with her. At some point, Ron realized that his wife was having an affair, but he reacted as a very understanding person. Ron and Patty agreed to buy Jaime a car so he could go to Texas and stop being part of their lives. Patty and Jaime went to a car dealership to choose a car. Patty told the detectives that they bought the car, packed his things into it, and sent him off to Texas. And this happened just before Ron's murder. Now, however, she was afraid that Jaime would come back to finish what he started, to kill her. However, after reviewing the surveillance camera footage at the dealership, detectives found out that the love affair hadn't ended because Patty and Jaime were holding hands and hugging each other affectionately. But before the investigators could summon the woman for a candid conversation, a new twist emerged in the case. Patty disappeared. A month to the day after Ron's murder, the detectives drove back to the same house. Again, they approached the front door, crossed the threshold once more. The feeling of déjà vu never left them, especially when they saw that the small house had become the scene of another bloody crime. Blood was everywhere, in the kitchen, the living room, the bathroom, even on the doorstep. Chairs were overturned, rugs were displaced as if something had been dragged across the floor. A bloodied kitchen knife lay on the TV stand. The air was thick with the smell of blood, and the bathroom door was broken with bullet holes in it. Everything seemed unreal, like a stage set. Amidst this gruesome scene, the detectives found a note made from cut-out magazine letters. They had never seen such notes before, except in movies. It stated that Patty had been kidnapped. Exactly what Patty had feared Jaime would do. The police began their search for the woman and distributed her description to officers. The next day, July 25, 2008, hundreds of kilometers away from the Prespa family home in Salt Lake City, Utah, a patrol officer was checking the registration numbers of cars in a motel parking lot when he noticed a green Hyundai. A quick check revealed that the car was linked to a murder investigation. The officer contacted detectives from California who informed him that two people were associated with this car, Jaime Ramos and Patricia Prespa. Approximately 5 minutes later, the door of the motel room opened and a woman came out. She walked straight to the police officer. He aimed his weapon at her, but the woman stated that she was Patricia Prespa, and she added, "He's in the room, he's been shot." The policeman didn't know what to think and couldn't imagine what he would see when he entered that door. He and his partner burst open the door and shouted, "Police!" But there was no response. Someone was clearly lying on the bed. The policeman demanded that the person raise their hands and come out, but the person didn't move. The officer thought the person under the blanket was dead. He grabbed the blanket and saw that there was a wounded person there. It was Jaime Ramos. He looked at the policeman and said, raising his hands, "Don't shoot. They've already shot me." Both Patricia and Jaime were taken into custody. While Jaime received medical attention, detectives questioned Patricia. Patty claimed that she also became a victim of Jaime. She recounted that she was sleeping in her bed when suddenly she was grabbed by a man wearing a mask made from a stocking, gloves, and a jumpsuit. She managed to break free, but he lunged at her again. They struggled, wreaking havoc around them. It was only when he dragged her into the kitchen that she realized it was Jaime, although she had never seen him like that before. He confessed to her that he had killed her husband, and she would be next. At one point, Jaime attempted to strike her with a large kitchen knife, slashing her hand as she tried to shield herself. However, she managed to reach the bedroom, grabbed a .44 Magnum revolver, and locked herself in the bathroom. Jaime smashed the door, and that's when she fired 3 times. Dropping the weapon, she ran outside, but even after she shot him 3 times with the Magnum, Jaime caught up with her and seized her. Now he had the gun, and he ordered her to get into his car. They stopped several times along the way, notably to refuel. Detectives puzzled over why she didn't escape from the wounded man while he was refueling the car. Patty replied that she was terrified. What happened next was known to the police. Here, the story could have ended, and Patty would have appeared a heroine if Jaime had died from the gunshot wounds. He was indeed close to death when they found him in the hotel, but he received timely medical attention and he was ready to talk to the police. When at the age of 21, Jaime was admitted to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, where he was given a job, he felt like he had hit the jackpot. He quickly befriended other members of the organization, particularly his roommate Curtis, as well as his supervisor Patty. Initially, he regarded her as a friend and mentor, but soon their relationship became much closer. She didn't immediately confess to Jaime that she was married. Even more so, she didn't tell him how 6 years ago she had to work hard to make Ron fall in love with her when her third husband left her. But she told him that she was living in an unhappy marriage. Jaime's heartstrings were deeply touched by Patty's confessions. The thing was, he himself had been tormented by a male relative for years. It started when he was 6. It started when he was 6 years old, ended at 16, and occurred once or twice a month. Jaime asked Patty to leave her husband, but she always found some excuse why it was impossible. Then she mentioned another option. At first it was like a game, a joke. The woman said, "Do you want me to leave him? What if something unfortunate happens to him?" "Which we arrange?" Jaime asked incredulously. "What else?" Patty initiated conversations about how Ron liked to work around the house and might fall from a ladder onto something sharp or get hit by a car. It seemed like a joke until she showed her lover an envelope with insurance. And then he realized that everything they talked about was serious. She convinced him that after receiving the money, they could start over. Jaime would go to college first and they would live together. She took out insurance on her husband and was supposed to receive $150,000 in case of his death. But if his death occurred as a result of an accident, the wife would receive $300,000. This is called double insurance. Double Insurance is also the name of a true classic of cinema, a film in which a woman seduces a man and persuades him to kill her husband. And then the seductress shoots the naive lover. Jaime hadn't watched that movie, but Patty clearly understood its essence. Or Oscar Wilde was right, and life ultimately does imitate art. But Jaime had no intention of becoming a murderer, and Patty started pressing him. "Don't you believe me? Don't you believe that he's tormenting me, beating me? Don't you want to live with me?" She didn't leave the man infatuated with her any other choice. So he set her a condition. He had to personally see what Ron was really like. The woman agreed. She told her husband that a guy at work insulted her, but Jaime stood up for her, beat him, and therefore he was expelled from the program. Now he had nowhere to live. Ron, being a kind soul, of course, offered the guy to stay with them. He personally went for Jaime, brought him home, and thanked him for standing up for his wife. He said that Jaime could live with them for free and only asked him to help around the house, because what the guy did for him was already enough payment. So Jaime started living with his mistress and her husband. Ron behaved friendly, taught him how to use various tools, and in general treated the guy like a son. But Jaime was most concerned that Ron never raised his voice to his wife, never scolded her, never refused her anything, and it clearly wasn't a show for the public. Doubts began to creep into his mind. Patty described a monster, but Jaime saw a completely different Ron. However, Patty wasn't about to back down. She skillfully manipulated the guy, convincing him that he was saving her from a cruel husband, and set a date for when Jaime would have to attack Ron. Otherwise, he would have to leave and never see her again. The thought of this was unbearable for Jaime. Tuesday, June 24th came, one of the longest days of the year. That evening, Ron sat calmly in his armchair by the fireplace watching TV. Patty had indeed gone to her daughter's, but she kept calling her lover, asking if he had finished with her husband yet and why he was taking so long. She insisted that it would be easier to cover up the evidence if it happened outside, so Jaime told Ron that he heard some noise in the pen with his pigs. Ron, of course, believed him and went to check, but Jaime couldn't bring himself to attack the man. When Ron returned home, he sat back in his favorite armchair. Jaime sat on a chair in the kitchen 3 meters away from him and drank a lot of water, as if delaying what he was about to do, trying to calm down. Patty continued to call, asking when everything would be over. Jaime saw the hammer and decided that if one blow to the head rendered Ron unconscious, it would be enough for him. He took one last sip of water, put on gloves, wiped the hammer. The house was so small. Ron was so close. Jaime told himself, "You're doing everything right." He thought about the violence against Patty, remembered how he himself had been abused, and the anger from the flooding memories allowed him to feel a sharp adrenaline rush. He literally jumped up from the chair, ran to Ron, and struck the man 3 times quickly on the head. Ron barely had time to scream, "Why?" But Jaime seemed to snap. He shouted, "How dare you torment my wife? Yes, Patty is my wife now. How dare you hit her?" He struck the man 3 more times, smashing his skull. Then he dropped the hammer. Amazingly, he felt relieved, knowing that he did it for her. But to do everything as she wanted, the killer had to take the body out of the house and create the appearance of an accident. To put Ron in the driver's seat, he had to build a mini-trap from the ladder and plywood. After that, Jaime sat next to the deceased and directed the car towards the cliff, sitting next to the bloodied man whose head he had just smashed. To distract himself from such a reality, he remembered the movie Sin City. There's a scene where a killer drives down a deserted road with a corpse sitting next to him. But when Jaime watched that movie 3 years ago, he couldn't have imagined he would do something similar. On the way, he threw away Ron's chair, the bloodied carpet, and the hammer. Then at the canyon, he used all the props to prepare the final scene of the accident. He doused the car with gasoline, prepared a propane tank, put the man's foot on the gas pedal, flicked his lighter. It was at that moment that the blood flowing from the car spilled onto the road and created a puddle. Jaime set fire to the SUV and rolled the car down. He noticed a packet. Cleaning up at home, he collected pieces of brain in a packet, and now it fell out of the car. Jaime threw it into the ditch, thinking the fire would destroy it. Then he ran to his car, waiting for him at the cliff, and wanted to drive to Texas, but he couldn't. He had to see her. When he entered the house, Patty was washing her husband's blood in the living room. And right where Ron had been killed a few hours earlier, Patty's 3-year-old granddaughter sat watching cartoons on TV. Patty flew into a rage when she saw him. Jaime asked to hug him goodbye. Patty reluctantly complied, and he finally left. On the way, alone with his thoughts, he began to realize what he had done. He felt very ashamed and sick. Jaime was supposed to go to Texas to be with his relatives, but when the police didn't believe in the accident and began investigating the murder, Patty became nervous. She ordered him to go somewhere they wouldn't find him. Her anxiety multiplied when a month later, Jaime told her he was returning to California. The investigators had traced him back to his grandmother, the woman who raised him and whom he obeyed unquestioningly. She told her grandson that he shouldn't behave as if he were guilty of something and return to California to talk to the police. Jaime agreed, but on his way back, despite his grandmother's and the investigators' advice, he called Patty. Apparently, that's when Patty realized that he was becoming a problem, and it was time to abandon him to save herself. She listened to Jaime and replied that she had a plan that would allow them to spend the rest of their lives together. Wasn't this what he had always dreamed of? She wanted to make it seem as if Jaime had abducted her. He agreed, thinking they would leave together and lie low for a while. Patty ordered her lover to overturn all the furniture in her house and knock down the bathroom door to make the abduction look more realistic. But she didn't warn him that she would be hiding behind it with a magnum. And as soon as he broke the door, she shot. Once, twice, thrice. She hit his hand, leg, and clavicle area. Jaime was in shock, asking, "How could you do this?" The woman calmly approached and pressed the gun to his head, but the gun didn't fire. While Jaime lay on the floor in blood, she went to another room, tried to fix the gun, but changed her mind and left. For some reason, Jaime decided to follow her. Even more unbelievably, Patty said to him, "Okay, let's go." And they left the state together. The next day, Jaime's car was spotted at a motel in Salt Lake City, and the couple was taken into custody. But Patty wasn't done yet. She still had one last hope, to convince Jaime to take the blame. But how could she do that? Before the trial, Patty and Jaime were held in a small jail together, and the plumbing arrangement of the prison allowed Patty to once again get into the heart and soul of her young lover. If you simultaneously flush the water in the female and male toilets, you can talk as if you are in the same room. Most likely, Patty wasn't the first to discover this, but she cleverly took advantage of this peculiarity, persuading Jaime to stick to her version. Allegedly, at first, she also wished for her husband's death, but changed her mind. And then Jaime killed Ron and abducted her, trying to get rid of the only witness. Remarkably, Jaime was willing to go along with this for her sake. However, when the boy's lawyer learned about it, he intervened and shuffled the cards for Patty. He contacted the only person who could break the spell over the woman, Jaime's grandmother. The grandmother and the beloved aunts of the young man ordered him to tell the whole truth. In the interrogation room, the investigators witnessed the power Patty had over Jaime. Despite her confession and everything she had done, Jaime begged for the opportunity to see her. In June 2009, the preliminary hearing began. Unexpectedly, it turned out that Jaime was not the only one whom Patty had tried to persuade to commit murder. Her friend took the witness stand and told that Patty had asked her if she knew anyone who could go for this crime. But even stranger was that she once wanted to kill her ex-husband and then asked the ex-husband if he would kill Ron. On June 29, 2009, Jaime pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and agreed to testify against Patty. But he did not get such an opportunity. Just a couple of days before the start of the trial in February 2010, she also admitted guilt. She was sentenced to imprisonment from 42 years to life for Ron's murder and attempted murder of Jaime. Jaime was sentenced from 25 years to life. Just before starting his sentence, Jaime met with Ron's 2 daughters and told them that he was a wonderful person. He treated him kindly, and Jaime also managed to love him for the short time he knew him. Yet despite what his own eyes had seen, Jaime chose to believe Patty. She chose an impressionable, vulnerable boy who was not loved in childhood, got into his soul, and made him do what she needed.
On March 1, 2011, at 2 o'clock in the morning, Gisela Daoud heard her phone ringing. An unknown number appeared on the screen. It was a police officer from the city of Valence, asking if she was the mother of Samira Ben Saad. She answered yes. Gisela couldn't understand why the police were looking for her 20-year-old daughter, Samira. She hadn't seen her for 3 days. The woman demanded an explanation of what was happening. But the police response did not calm her at all. The caller stated that they were searching for Samira because her boyfriend, 22-year-old Mael Combia, had gone missing. The police had discovered that the young couple had been dating for 8 months. However, Gisela knew nothing about the guy. Samira and Mael had met at a party. Samira Ben Saad was a very beautiful woman who was aware of her attractiveness. She wanted to become a model and loved posing for photographs. Mael, in turn, was also a very nice and pleasant young man. There was an immediate mutual attraction between them, and they started seeing each other. However, on February 28, 2011, at 9:45 p.m., Mael's boss from the construction company contacted the police. He was worried because he hadn't heard from his employee for 3 days. On Saturday morning, the guy came to work, and then his phone rang. He quickly got up and left without any explanation, and no one had seen him since. On Monday morning, his boss was surprised that he still hadn't shown up. They considered him a punctual and responsible employee, and it was the first time he didn't come to work. His boss found out that Mael wasn't answering calls from colleagues and friends, so he decided to contact the police. First, the police went to the guy's home in the city center of Valence, but it yielded no results because no one answered the doorbell. His car was not at the house either. On the same evening, the police talked to Mael's mother. She hadn't received any news from her son for 3 days and added that during their last meeting, he had behaved very unusually, being extremely emotional and tense. The woman mentioned that her son hugged and kissed her and said he loved her, something he had never done before. The details uncovered by the investigators seemed very suspicious. Mael and Samira disappeared on the same day without explaining anything to anyone, and had not contacted their families for 3 days. It couldn't be a coincidence. One clue came from examining their phones. The investigators found out that Samira and Mael didn't just leave at the same time, but they left together in Mael's car. The phone pings revealed that on Saturday, in the middle of the day, they headed to Nice, and in the evening, they checked into a luxury hotel on the promenade. The investigators contacted the hotel and learned that there were surveillance cameras capturing 2 guys and a woman. The description perfectly matched Samira and Mael. They left Nice on Sunday morning and arrived in Livorno, 400 kilometers east of the border between France and Italy, by the evening. The young couple was clearly heading further into Italy, and the French police sought assistance from their Italian colleagues. Mael had booked a room in a prestigious hotel in Livorno. The hotel staff confirmed that a guy and a woman matching the description of the missing couple had stayed with them. So, Saturday evening was spent in Nice, and the next day they headed to Livorno. Everything indicated that Samira and Mael had embarked on a spontaneous romantic journey, especially considering that the Riviera was conducive to such adventures. The detectives believed that the young couple would soon return home together, and they had no reason to doubt this theory, especially since Samira's mother received a message from her daughter stating that she had left but there was no need to worry because she would return soon. It seemed like it should have been another confirmation that everything was fine with the young couple, but Gazella was certain that her daughter would never disappear just by impulsively leaving for a trip. Samira was a responsible woman who never missed work. There was another detail that troubled Gazella. She couldn't understand how her daughter, who loved being photographed and never left the house without meticulously applied makeup, styled hair, and carefully chosen clothes, could go away for several days with a young man without taking any belongings with her. She was also puzzled by the fact that Samira sent an SMS. The thing is, she would usually just call her mother. They were close and could talk for hours, so receiving a text message didn't calm her down. Instead, it only worried her even more. The next news about the case came from the city of Imperia, located in northern Italy, approximately 80 kilometers from Nice. On Monday, March 3, 2011, Massimo Bessone was on his way to work when he turned onto a small street to take a shortcut. Along the road, he noticed something strange. At first, he thought he saw a mannequin, but when he opened the door, he realized it was a woman. Massimo shouted something but received no response. However, the woman was clearly moving. He quickly called for an ambulance. Italian police determined that she was the missing French woman. Someone had shot her in the back of the head, and the bullet had lodged in her skull. The theory of a romantic trip could now be discarded. The French police were perplexed. Initially, it was a case of suspicious disappearance, then they thought it was a love-related escape, but now they were dealing with a girl who had been wounded in an attempted murder. Samira was alive but in critical condition. She was immediately taken to the hospital, and her mother was informed. When Gazella arrived at the hospital, she didn't even recognize her own daughter at first. It's difficult to describe the sight. Samira's head was shaved bald, and she resembled a 9-year-old child. The woman refused to believe that her daughter ended up in Italy with a bullet in her head. The doctors told the mother that there was little hope since the bullet was lodged in her daughter's skull. But Gazella didn't want to accept that and arranged for Samira to be transported to a hospital in Marseille. There, A surgeon informed her directly that he would perform the operation but wouldn't provide false hope. Even if the patient survived, she would never fully recover. Samira underwent a 10-hour operation. Although she made it through the surgery, when she opened her eyes, she didn't recognize anyone and couldn't speak. She had to relearn everything like a young child. While Samira couldn't tell anything about what happened in Italy, the police had to search for the culprit without her testimony. Many indications pointed to the crime being planned. She was found lying on the side of the road near a landfill, and the Italian police couldn't find any of her belongings. There was no purse, no phone, no passport. This indicated that the perpetrator wanted her to remain unidentified. However, the investigators had a lead. The last person Samira was seen with was her boyfriend, Mael Combia. The police believed that Mael crossed the border into Italy to commit the crime and then fled. However, he made a mistake by using his bank card in France after Samira was found. He used it at a first-class hotel in Les Tourettes, just 35 kilometers from his apartment in Valence. Surveillance cameras showed that Mael had returned to France a day earlier. But if he was innocent, why didn't he go home to his family? Instead, he stayed in a hotel just a few kilometers away. Soon, he made another mistake. Investigators discovered that he had used Samira's credit card. In other words, the young couple embarked on a spontaneous trip to another country, where the woman nearly died, and Mael stayed in a hotel and used her card. Everything confirmed the police's worst suspicions. To search for a motive, the detective spoke with the family and friends of the young man. It became clear that Samira and Mael's relationship was far from perfect. Samira was a very beautiful woman, and many men showed interest in her, which bothered Mael. Their arguments often escalated into physical violence. Mael could slap Samira in front of their friends, and there was even an incident where he extinguished a cigarette on her. Obviously, he couldn't be considered a very stable person. But the question of the motive remained open. Did Mael act in a fit of rage, or was everything planned in advance? All their friends knew that Samira was infatuated with Mael despite his behavior. However, she recently found out that her boyfriend was married. He had gotten married to his girlfriend at the age of 18, and frequently cheated on her. Samira was far from being his only mistress. She was angered by the revelation but didn't break up with him because she believed Mael's claim that they were in the process of divorce and living separately. Upon discovering this, the investigator went to Mael's home. But as soon as he entered, he realized that Samira was mistaken, and the husband and wife were clearly living together. Furthermore, Mael was soon to become a father. The apartment had 17 ultrasound photos with the name Combia written on them. It was evident that Mael, his wife, and Samira were involved in a love triangle, and one of them was destined to disappear. It was necessary to find Mael, and it turned out to be much easier than the police had anticipated. Mael Combia surrendered himself 5 days after the disappearance, appearing at the Valence police station on March 4. This was an incredible stroke of luck for the investigation. Mael not only came to the station voluntarily but also directly confessed that he was the one who shot Samira. He then proceeded to recount what had happened. The young man claimed that Samira was just an acquaintance with whom he could spend pleasant time. Their relationship had no future, and she knew it. Mael explained that their romance had come to an end, but Samira couldn't accept it. She didn't give him a moment's peace, constantly calling him and sometimes dialing his number 150 times in a single day. He showed the investigator his phone, which displayed evidence that Samira had called him approximately 1,000 times in a month. Mael's words confirmed that Samira's behavior could be classified as stalking. But could this be considered a justification for shooting her? Soon, the situation escalated to the point where the young man feared for his life. He recounted what happened on the Friday evening before their departure to Italy. Samira confronted him in a nightclub while he was kissing another woman. She stormed out of the club, scratched his car with her key, and they began arguing, which escalated into a fight with Samira's cousins. This incident terrified Mael because they claimed to have weapons and threatened to kill him. Mael was in a panic. He quickly got into his car and left the nightclub, deciding that he needed to come up with a way to protect himself in the future. The idea of acquiring a weapon for his own defense crossed his mind. The next day, when he received a call, he impulsively left and went to buy a revolver. However, all of this still didn't explain why he shot Samira. Mael explained that he didn't go to Italy to kill her or commit any other terrible act. He simply wanted to put an end to their troubled relationship. He drove Samira to Italy to calm down their heated emotions and explain everything to her. But things didn't go as planned. They argued again in the car, and Mael got out. Samira followed him. According to Mael, he grabbed the weapon with the intention of scaring her but had no intention to shoot. However, the revolver went off accidentally. Afterward, he left her lying on the ground, got back into the car, and drove away. When asked why he didn't call for an ambulance, he said he was scared when she fell. He went into hiding for several days because he didn't know what to do. The rest of the story was already known to the police. Overall, the man claims that he was the victim of his obsessive lover's pursuit, and what happened in Italy was an accident. He was arrested for attempted murder, but his explanation didn't fully convince the police. Some pieces didn't fit together. Why would someone travel to another country and stay in a luxury hotel just to end a relationship? Why did he take all her personal belongings and then use her credit card? And who sent the message to Samira's mother from her daughter's phone? The investigator had no doubt that the young man was lying, but it was difficult to prove without Samira's testimony. Fortunately, over time and with therapy, Samira was able to provide her testimony. At first, with a weak voice and very slowly, Samira began to speak. On October 11, 2011, 8 months after the attack, she recounted her version of events. Samira's words contradicted the claims of her former lover. He came to her home, stating that they needed to talk. She didn't want to, but he insisted, so she relented. Mael invited her for a weekend getaway. She asked where he wanted to go, and he replied, Spain. This didn't sit well with her, so he took her to Nice instead, and from there, they went to Italy. After 2 days of leisure, on the third day of the trip, Mael unexpectedly veered off the road. When asked why he turned onto a road leading to a landfill, he reassured her not to worry because he simply needed to dispose of something. Mael stopped the car and got out. He opened the passenger side door for her to exit and retrieved a revolver. Pointing it at her, he declared that she would die. "Shoot if you're a man," she exclaimed. And he fired the gun. On February 7, 2012, a year after the attack on Samira, forensic experts found the revolver, and this discovery completely refuted Mael's claims. According to his version, the gun in his hand unexpectedly went off. However, ballistic analysis showed that such an event could not have occurred. The expert explained that before firing, the shooter needs to carefully prepare, pull the trigger back and then shoot, which involves 2 distinct actions. You cannot simply wave your hand for the revolver to fire. Furthermore, to pull the trigger of the revolver backward, one needs to hold the weapon with one hand and apply significant force to accomplish the action with the other hand. Accidentally firing such a firearm was utterly impossible. Mael Combia lied. He wanted to kill Samira, and after several months of investigation, detectives were able to reconstruct the plan that the murderer had conceived. On February 26, 2011, at 9 a.m., Mael left work. He was determined to avoid a repeat of the previous night's scene at all costs, so he purchased a weapon. Heading to the woods, he tested it, loaded it, pulled the trigger, and fired. He had planned everything. After a romantic weekend in Italy, Samira was supposed to disappear on the other side of the border. Italy served as the perfect country to commit the crime since he had no connections there. Driving off the road, Mael pulled the woman out of the car, declared he would kill her, and shot her. Then he took her belongings to prevent her identification. Returning to France, Mael attempted to mislead the police by sending an SMS to Samira's mother. Everyone was supposed to believe that the woman had gone on a trip and was still alive. The guy believed he had committed the perfect crime and was confident that he would never be caught. Imagine his surprise when he discovered that his victim had survived. While the police were searching for him, he spent 5 days hiding near his hometown, contemplating his next actions. He lacked the means and useful connections to escape, so he devised a new strategy for self-defense. Mael Combia decided to go to the police and present his version of events. On February 10, 2014, the trial of Mael began in the city of Valence. The trial was a real ordeal for the victim and her family. To their immense surprise, Mael did not deviate from his version of events. He insisted that he was the victim in this case, and Samira had been harassing him, and everything that happened in Italy was an unfortunate accident. His friends stated that he had never been an aggressive person and purchased the revolver out of fear after threats from Samira's cousins, who had threatened to destroy his apartment, car, and kill Mael himself. He hid nothing and went on a trip to Italy in his own car, taking his phone with him. He simply wanted to take the woman on a trip to calm her down, as he was emotionally exhausted from Samira's constant call. It is also worth noting that Mael conducted himself with exaggerated politeness and respect during the trial, effortlessly charming the jury, and his strategy paid off. He was sentenced to 13 years of imprisonment. The lenient sentence made many wonder if there was a connection between Mael's behavior in court and the relatively short duration of the sentence chosen by the jury. After all, people often associate criminals with unpleasant personalities, and it is difficult for them to convict a charming young man with excellent manners. Samira considers this punishment too lenient, as by the time he turns 40, he will be a free man, able to live a normal life, while she will forever remain bound to a wheelchair simply because she loved a man who decided to kill her. The surgeon explained that during 1 year of therapy, Samira regained 80% of her abilities, after which the effectiveness of rehabilitation sharply declined, leaving her dependent on the help of others for the rest of her life. She admits that she was willing to do anything for love, and this is how he repaid her. Christy Marceau woke up from a sudden phone call. The girl was sleeping in her room. It was 10 a.m. on Tuesday, September 6, 2011, and the 18-year-old student from the University of Technology in Auckland, New Zealand, didn't need to get up early. The phone stopped ringing before Christy picked up the receiver. But then, a few seconds later, it rang again. The girl answered. A male voice on the other end of the line asked to speak to Christy. "This is Christy," the girl said. It turned out that the caller was her acquaintance, Akshay-chan. Until recently, they both worked at a local supermarket. They weren't friends, but they sometimes talked at work and outside of it, exchanging messages on Facebook. They lived just a few blocks apart, and Akshay had come to Christy's house a few times. He often needed someone to talk to about his personal problems. Kind and compassionate, Christy was always ready to listen to him. The girl knew that Akshay had been going through a tough time lately, but she couldn't imagine what he would say next. Her heart sank when he uttered, "I dissolved 40 tablets in a drink, and if you don't come to my house within 10 minutes, I will drink it." Without a second thought, the girl hurried to help Akshay. Christy was in such a rush after Akshay's call that she had hardly any time to get dressed. She quickly put on sweatpants and a sweater over her sleepwear, grabbed her keys and mobile phone, jumped into her car, and drove about a kilometer to Akshay's house. It was unusual for Christy to ignore a cry for help. She always tried to assist those who had a harder time in life. Unlike the sociable Christy, Akshay-chan didn't have many friends. Everyone recognized his extraordinary intellect, but he found it difficult to communicate with other kids, especially girls. When fate brought them together at work in a local supermarket, Akshay began sharing his inner struggles with her. The girl sympathized with him, but in June 2011, she started a new job and saw Akshay much less frequently. By the time he called her on September 6, A considerable amount of time had passed since their last meeting. Christy had only 2 minutes to arrive at the apartment building where the guy lived with his mother and younger sister. She parked her car, rushed up the stairs, and knocked on the door. Akshay let her inside. Christy followed him through the entrance door, which he locked behind them. There was no one else at home. Akshay's mother was at work, and his 16-year-old sister was at school. As Christy sat down in a chair opposite him, she noticed a small amount of white powder on the table. It looked like someone had crushed tablets. Obviously, Chand hadn't lied when he mentioned the glass with the medication. Christy asked him where the drink was. "Do you think I'm that stupid?" He replied. "Of course, I hid it because I knew you would find it." Concerned, the girl tried to persuade Akshay to seek professional help. Her words disappointed him. From his perspective, Christy wasn't helping him cope with depression after she left the supermarket. Christy explained that she was torn between her university studies and her new job. But Chand argued that she could spare 5 minutes to chat with him on Facebook, and that would be enough. Then he added, "Let's face it, you weren't that busy." Christy became increasingly uneasy. The more he blamed her, the more she explained that she couldn't help him. He needed to reach out to a specialist. This angered Akshay even more. He jumped out of his chair and reached into his pocket for a kitchen knife. The knife was long and very sharp. Akshay held onto the handle tightly, brandishing it in front of Christy. "This is how we're going to do it," he said. "If you scream, I'll stab you with the knife." Christy began whimpering in response, prompting Chand to order her to be quiet and calm down. The girl still held onto her mobile phone, contemplating how to send a message to her friend asking for help. But Chand noticed the phone and demanded that she hand it over. Christy clung to her phone tightly, as if it were her only connection to the outside world. Failing to forcefully take the phone from her, Chand threatened the girl again, implying he would resort to using the weapon. He snatched the girl's mobile phone, and suddenly, Chand began to talk. He declared that he had big plans for the day. He decided to scare the girl, seek revenge on her for not supporting him during his most difficult period, and finally put an end to everything in one fell swoop. Then he demanded that Christy take off her sweater and hand it over to him. After searching through it, he demanded her blue top. The girl refused, but predictably, the guy threatened her with the knife. Christy complied. Then he ordered her to stand up and show that she wasn't hiding anything in her pants. She emptied her pockets, but it wasn't enough for him, and he wanted her to remove the sweatpants she was wearing. Christy refused and broke down in even greater tears. But realizing that she had no choice, she undressed, leaving herself only in her underwear. Chand crumpled her clothes into a pile, sat back in the chair, and began rambling about various things. He spouted nonsense about how people like Christy make others suffer. He accused her of coming to him only when it was already too late. Overall, more time had passed since Christy arrived at his place. Terrified, she asked if he planned to kill her. Chand reminded her of his plans for the day, to frighten her, seek revenge, and drink the prepared drink. He hadn't previously specified how he planned to seek revenge, but now he was ready to tell her. Akshay Chand wanted to violate Christy. Upon hearing this, the girl burst into tears, which prompted Chand to ask her to calm down. Then, out of the blue, he changed his mind. He returned Christy's clothes, phone, and told her she could leave. Still overwhelmed with fear, Christy initially didn't believe the sudden change in the guy's mood. What if he planned to stab her in the back, catching her off guard when she turned away? She shared her concerns with Chand, forcing him to lower the knife. "I'm letting you go, but you should know that as soon as you leave, I will drink the concoction," he said. Christy once again tried to persuade him to abandon this plan. Despite what he had put her through, her character didn't allow her to leave after such words. But Chand insisted. Too frightened to linger any longer, Christy turned around and ran out of the apartment. She hurried down the stairs to her car. Passers-by walked by, unaware of what had just happened to her. Christy wanted to ask one of them for help, but she realized she wouldn't feel safe until she reached home. Getting into her car, Christy locked the doors, started the engine, and drove home. From the perspective of Christy's parents, Brian and Tracy Marceau, she was their little miracle. After the birth of their first child, a girl named Heather, Tracy and Brian Marceau had been trying to become parents again. However, it took 6 years before Christy was born. By 2011, the very close-knit family members were living far apart. Heather had moved out of the family home a few years ago, and Brian was working in Australia. Tracy was planning to move to Australia soon to be closer to her husband. Christy was also looking forward to the move. As her first year at the University of Auckland's School of Hospitality and Tourism approached its end, where she was studying event management, she could continue her education in Australia. By the age of 30, the young woman dreamed of starting her own event planning company. Currently, she still lived in her parents' home, where she grew up in the suburb of Hillcrest. On the morning of the attack on Christy, Tracy was at work when her phone rang around 11:30 a.m. It was her mother, Shirley, who lived together with Tracy and Christy in the same house. Tracy answered, and in the background, she heard Christy's hysterical crying. Then she heard her mother's voice, telling her to come home immediately because Christy had been attacked. Tracy arrived home within 15 minutes. Upon seeing her mother, Christy threw herself into her arms and didn't want to let go. Trembling and crying incessantly, she recounted what Akshay Chand had done to her. Tracy hardly knew Akshay, but she remembered that once, while seeing off Brian at the airport, they returned home with their daughter and found him waiting at the doorstep. Akshay and Christy chatted briefly. Christy assured her mother that she just needed someone to talk to, but Tracy didn't like him right away. He evoked a strange feeling in her, and she asked her daughter to stop communicating with him. However, the girl was confident that there was nothing to worry about, and Tracy had never heard of Akshay again until this incident. Shocked by the details of what had happened, Tracy immediately took her daughter to the police station. In the police station, Christy repeated her account of the attack. She didn't know why Akshay had a change of heart and let her go, but she was certain that it wasn't the end and that he would attack her again because he had been stalking her for some time. She didn't tell her parents that she had found him sitting on the steps of her house on more than one occasion. At one point, he left a note for her in the mailbox, confessing his love and thanking her for the support she had provided, which he desperately needed. Chand also insisted that Christy accept a large sum of money as a gift. She took the money but didn't spend it, believing that he would demand it back. And indeed, a few days later, he did. When she left work at the supermarket, Chand quit his job on the same day, stating that he had no reason to stay there without her. After that, their communication ceased, and it became evident that Akshay had built up a lot of anger towards Christy, believing that she had abandoned him. The thought of him being out there frightened her, and the police recognized the danger she faced. As a result, Akshay Chand was promptly placed under arrest. Akshay admitted to everything and stated that the drink he threatened to consume contained multivitamins. However, he genuinely believed that consuming them in large quantities was toxic. In the police station, he calmly explained that his motive was revenge. Chand was angry at Christy because she didn't help him with his depression, and he openly expressed that he still harbored thoughts of vengeance. The police were extremely concerned about his behavior. It was a significant leap from someone who had never had any issues with the law to a criminal charged with abduction, attempted sexual assault, and threats of harm. Since he was still angry at Christy, the detectives knew it was crucial to keep Chand in custody until he could appear in court. They prepared a document outlining the reasons why Chand should not be released on bail, emphasizing Christy's fear and the proximity of their homes. They highlighted the fact that he could appear at her doorstep within minutes if he desired. 3 days after the attack, Akshay appeared in court. His lawyer argued that her client should be released on bail because he was only 18 years old. According to the law at that time, Individuals over 17 but under 20 years old were typically eligible for bail if they had no prior convictions. Since Chand had never been arrested before, his lawyer claimed that he should be granted bail. She promised that he would take antidepressant medication, and if released on bail, his family would supervise him. However, the judge believed that it was not appropriate to release a person who had shown unwavering determination to carry out his actions. Despite the law, the judge stated that the only circumstance in which she would consider granting bail was if Chand agreed to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital. However, this option was unlikely. Therefore, the judge decided to defer the bail decision, and requested a psychiatric evaluation for Akshay. Throughout this time, Christy continued to suffer. Her father was scheduled to return from Australia in a week, and she convinced her family not to inform him about what had happened so that he could continue working without worry. Initially, she was afraid not only to travel in public transportation but even to sleep in her own room. Whenever she heard any sound at night, she immediately asked her family to check what it was. Her greatest fear was that Akshay would be released and would attack her family or fixate on another innocent girl. By early November, life began to slowly improve. Chand was scheduled to appear in court on Wednesday, November 9th, and in 2 months, Christy and her family would be living in Australia. The relocation, which was initially meant to mark the beginning of an exciting new chapter in their lives, now became an urgent necessity. On the morning of November 7th, Tracy got up at 6:30, and began preparing for her workday. She let the dogs out, made breakfast, and took a shower. As she was getting dressed, she heard a knock on the door. It was still early, around 7 a.m., but Tracy wasn't surprised by the knock. Christy loved shopping online, and her orders were usually delivered in the morning. While Christy was still asleep, getting some rest before her late shift at work, Tracy went to answer the door herself. There was a young man standing on the porch. Tracy didn't recognize him immediately, but then she realized it was Akshay Chanda. He was holding a knife. Tracy felt fear grip her as Chanda forced his way into her home. She screamed as loudly as she could, hoping that Christy would hear and understand that something terrible was happening and have time to escape. Or maybe the neighbors would hear and come to their aid. Still threatening Tracy with the knife, Chanda asked who else was in the house. Tracy lied and said her husband was home. That was not true. He had already returned to Australia. He had wanted to leave work, but the police convinced him that his family would be safe. But somehow Chanda seemed to know this, which made Tracy suspect he had been watching them for some time. Suddenly, Christy appeared on the stairs near Tracy and Chanda. Barefoot and in her sleepwear, she was awakened by her mother's scream and went upstairs to find out what was happening. When she saw Chanda, Christy screamed. Frozen with fear, she stood at the top of the stairs, unable to move. Chanda continued to direct the knife at Tracy, slowly advancing toward Christy. Then he kicked her in the chest, causing her to tumble down the stairs. Christy got up, ran down the steps, but slipped in her haste and fell again. She then got up and ran through her grandmother's room and into the backyard. Chanda chased after her. Meanwhile, Tracy called the police. Given what Chanda had done previously, she thought he might be trying to scare Christy again. She was confident that Christy would be able to lock herself in her grandmother's room, and Chanda wouldn't be able to reach her. The police were aware of the situation. They would be there within a few minutes and arrest Chanda. Tracy dialed emergency services. But before she could provide her address, she heard a frantic scream. It was Christy. Tracy dropped the phone and ran downstairs. Christy lay on the porch in the backyard, with a pool of blood spreading beneath her. Chanda stood nearby. Tracy rushed to her daughter and embraced her. She couldn't see any wounds, but Christy couldn't move. It seemed difficult for her to breathe. Tracy repeatedly told her daughter that she loved her and begged her to hold on because help was on the way. It seemed to Tracy that Christy was trying to say something to her. Looking into her eyes, Tracy saw that life had just left them. Christy was gone. Chanda just stood there. When Tracy looked at him, she saw that he still held the knife. The blade was bent at a 90-degree angle. Chanda himself was covered in blood. Showing no concern about what might happen to her next, Tracy screamed that he had killed Christy. With a completely emotionless voice, he replied, "I'm glad." The police arrived less than 10 minutes after the attack began. Chanda was still in the backyard, listening to music on an iPad. The broken knife lay on the ground. An officer asked what he was doing there. Chanda replied, "Retribution." Another officer noticed that Chanda's hands were trembling and asked why. He responded, "It's not easy to kill someone, is it?" Chanda was arrested and taken to the police station. Tracy had the difficult task of informing Heather and Brian about what had just happened to Christy. The Marceau family had been convinced that something like this would happen ever since Chanda was released on bail a month earlier. Initially, the judge denied his release, citing the need for further information about the case and the defendant's health condition. However, since he qualified for bail under the law, his lawyer quickly filed 2 applications for release. Chanda wrote a letter to the new judge, David McNaughton, expressing remorse for the attack on Christy. He stated that he deeply regretted what he had put the girl through and, given the opportunity, he would apologize to her and her family. Christy also wrote a letter to the judge, pleading not to release Akshay. She believed that since he had nothing to lose, he would attempt to attack her again. On October 5, the judge granted Chanda bail, despite reading Christy's letter and being aware that the police also believed it was right to keep him behind bars. Chanda was allowed to return to his home, which was located just 350 meters away from Christy's house, in a straight line. The police were extremely disappointed but assured the Marceau family that they would protect them. Officers promised to check on Chanda at various times of the day, making sure he was at home. All the officers patrolling the area were informed about the case. Overall, the police visited Chanda 23 times in the 32 days he was free, and each time he was at home. Despite the police assurances, Christy's fears grew. And after 32 days, he showed up at her doorstep with a knife. Forensic experts investigating the scene of her death found the knife Chanda used to stab her 10 to 15 times before it bent 90 degrees and became useless. He attacked her from behind, delivering a powerful blow to the back of her head. She fell to the floor, where Chanda continued to strike her on the back. One wound was so severe that Christy almost felt nothing afterwards. In the police station, Chanda was surprisingly calm and immediately confessed to everything. Despite suddenly releasing Christy on one occasion, he had never let go of his desire for revenge, and in prison, he started plotting her murder. Knowing that he needed to escape from prison to carry out his plan, he feigned remorse by writing a sympathetic letter to the judge. While free, he didn't waste any time and waited, knowing that Christy and her family would be protected by the police. Although the judge believed that Chanda's family would keep an eye on him throughout the day, his mother worked long hours, and his sister was too young for such a role. She was scared of him herself. All his mother could do was keep kitchen knives away from him, but Chanda knew what she had in mind and hid one of them. On November 7th, he woke up at 6:30, knowing that the day had come. In 2 days, he was scheduled to appear in court, and Christy probably believed that she was safe. The investigators were confident that Akshay would be found guilty on all charges, since he had confessed to everything. However, they were surprised when he decided to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Several experts, including one hired by his defense and 2 from the prosecution, evaluated him. Akshay told them that he had been hearing a persistent female voice for some time, especially in the mornings. He claimed that the voice ordered him to kill Christy and wished for her mother's death. Although initially Akshay could resist the voice's influence, he eventually succumbed to it. After consultations with psychiatrists and starting medication, he didn't express remorse for the murder but acknowledged that he would have to live with the knowledge of what he had done. It was incredibly difficult for Christy's parents to come to terms with the medical assessment. Tracy, in particular, struggled. She regretted opening the door to the killer and couldn't forget the last moments of Christie's life. "All I see, all I will ever see, is my daughter lying on my lap, gasping for air, covered in blood, dying for some senseless reason. He just stood there and watched, he didn't even attempt to escape. What kind of person does that?" She demanded punishment for Akshay, but the psychiatrist explained to her that Akshay's symptoms, previously attributed to depression, could now be explained by schizophrenia. Moreover, when depression is treated with medication, symptoms of schizophrenia can become more pronounced. During the first attack, the illness was in its early stage, and he managed to understand that harming the girl would be wrong, so he let her go. However, during the second incident, when he came for her, he was aware of what he was doing, but his illness prevented him from understanding that it was morally unacceptable. Akshay couldn't be tried for murder, but he was found guilty of kidnapping and attempted sexual assault. However, he would still serve his punishment in a psychiatric facility. He would only be released if he ceased to pose a danger to society, but his chances of recovery were extremely slim. The Marceau family relocated to Adelaide, Australia, but they didn't allow Christie's murder to become just another crime statistic. If Akshay had not been released on bail after the first crime, Christie would have moved to Australia and lived happily. Therefore, they started a campaign to change the bail laws. Thanks in part to their efforts, since 2013, defendants are required to prove that they are not a threat to society, instead of the police having to prove the opposite as it was before.